This post is an account of the events of the last few months. It's likely to be crumpled and sketchy. I'm writing it on my last nerves, you'll see why, and I don't have much time. If you find it, read it and spread it around. I'm not hoping for any help, but people should at least know. I don't even really hope anyone reads it at all. My internet is awful, I can't leave my apartment. I'll see if I can upload some photos, but I don't have high hopes. I enrolled in the philological faculty, as I had hoped. The philological faculty in the capital gave me the happiest opportunity to leave my ancestral home. The institute or the army were the only legitimate ways to leave it at all, and if I had failed to get in, I would have gone to the enlistment office myself. I would ask them to send me away. I had almost no strength left to endure the atmosphere that reigned at home. In the army I would have had to be very tough, but, believe me, I was willing to take the risk, just to get out from under my father's influence. My father is a fucking psychopath and a bastard domestic tyrant, and there was no way I would have written this truth even in an anonymous letter if I still had any hope of returning to normalcy. So, I did. The exams were a sham, but I thought I was going to have a heart attack right in front of the board with the names of the admitted applicants. My name was on the list. My parents rented me a studio apartment somewhere in the back of the universe. On one side of the house were garages and an indistinct industrial zone, while on the other side was a road, a vacant lot, and a forest of the same panel buildings, with the occasional splash of stores and kindergartens. I didn't care. I would have felt fine in a dorm, or in any shithole, as long as I was left to my own devices. My father immediately dismissed the idea of a dormitory. I was entitled to it as a stranger from afar, no whoring and drinking for his son, only hard study. Immediately I established, not gratuitous, contacts with curators and the dean's office. My father would know about any misconduct of mine instantly. I do not know the owner of this one-room apartment and have never seen him. My father found it himself, made all the arrangements and pays for it by card, as well as transferring my monthly allowance. He is ex-military. I am right now in this apartment on the 8th floor of a 12-story, long Leviathan-like building. For the first time in my life, I was breathing this air. It was the smell of freedom. I was free to go there and do what I thought was right, not just what was expected of me. As the weeks passed, the euphoria never waned. I had spent 17 years in one invariably tiny room or another in the company of the battered shadow of the empty woman who had been my mother and father. For the first time, hope for release flickered in me. All I needed was financial independence. I stood on the balcony that evening, mulling over my plans to get a part-time job as a translator/copywriter and smoking a cigarette that tasted unusually good because I could smoke it without being stealthy. It was at that moment that I noticed something amiss. As I said before, the house is long, and one side of it turns U-shaped and forms a small courtyard, so that I could see the windows of my own house practically opposite. In every lit window there were people standing motionless, looking out into the yard. I understood absolutely nothing. I glanced at my watch, 0:25. There were definitely no loud noises outside that could have attracted anyone to the windows. The neighborhood was surprisingly quiet. About a quarter of all the windows were lit, but still quite a few. And in every window there was a person, and in some places several. It looked pretty creepy for some reason, and I couldn't make out what everyone was staring at. In just a minute, everyone moved away from the windows, almost in sync, and got lost in the depths of the apartments. I didn't give the event any special significance. But a couple of days later the scene repeated itself completely. This time I was already standing on the balcony with a cigarette and a can of inexpensive beer, when a figure appeared in each of the illuminated windows. I dropped my half-drawn cigarette in surprise and burned my fingers slightly. It was 0:34 on the clock, and people had been standing at the windows for about 50 seconds. The next night at midnight I stood on the balcony, looking from the windows to the dial and back again. I had my phone in my hand, wanting to take a picture of the anomaly. It happened at 15 minutes till 1. Exactly like the previous times, people approached their windows at the same time. I managed to take a few pictures, but it turned out to be mostly useless. I had a phone bought by my father exclusively for the business, and as a result its camera is not particularly great. And yet I had some documentary evidence of the incomprehensible bullshit going on in my house. What about my neighbors? What is this supposed to mean? Some kind of crazy ritual? As I downloaded the photos to my laptop, I remembered that the usual cardboard panel noise that was going on behind the walls seemed to have been almost silenced for those seconds when the figures appeared in the windows. It was hard to tell from the balcony, though. The next night I confirmed my theory. In apartment buildings there is always, except in the dead of night, noise outside the walls. A TV, an argument, stomping from upstairs, someone to my right banging out monotonous scales on the piano, though it was a little late for that. At some point after midnight, always between midnight and 1 o'clock, everything seems to get cut off, except for the TV and some muffled Russian pop. Figures appear in the windows. They stand. They disappear. The background noise of life in the big house resumes as if nothing had happened. This means that my floor neighbors, as well as my upstairs neighbors, take part in a schizoid pantomime every night, dropping everything, going to the windows and looking out into the yard. You just can't see it from my balcony. When I realized this, I became very uncomfortable in my new apartment. While taking out the trash, I met my neighbor. She is a very ordinary woman. Her daughter and husband live across the street, and they moved here not so long ago. We laughed about a joke, and I vowed not to have any concerts or debauches. It was just a bunch of bullshit. So, what, she's just going to stare out the window every night too, standing there like a statue? I had a plan. I started going out into the courtyard of the building at midnight. I wanted to figure out what was attracting the attention of all those strange people there, but there was absolutely nothing in the courtyard. By day there were children playing on the playground, old men playing chess on the bench, and older boys occasionally playing ball in the hockey box. At night, though, the whole neighborhood died out around the house, and that wasn't particularly strange. Everybody just sat in their houses, some windows were lit, others dark, many of them showing the colored lightning bolts from the TV screens. The first floor of the house was completely occupied by stores, drugstores, and barbershops, and I couldn't get a good look at the people standing there on the second level at that moment. I went out into the courtyard several times, until one day, patrolling and peering through the windows, I finally saw a middle-aged woman and a little girl standing quite clearly, their head barely sticking out over the edge of the frame in the dark opening on the second floor level, devoid of any curtains. They stood, motionless, against the glass, looking straight at me, and their lips were moving. They were saying words. Their pained stares at me completely robbed me of my self-control, and I fled. The next night I went out to the road lit by the sparse lanterns, to the other side of the complex, lit a cigarette and waited. The block rose above me like a cliff, losing all the cozy familiarity of the panels. It was as if something had changed in the air of the place. Yes, this time people were coming to the windows on the outside, which had never happened before. Every single one of the windows, the dark ones, too, not just the ones with lights on, I realized now were filled with people, hundreds of people, and they weren't looking out into the yard, as I had thought at first. Instead, their stare was fixated onto me. Standing and watching, never taking their eyes off me. And then half a minute later, they retreated into the depths of the apartments, leaving the many curtains and drapes swaying. Total silence, and the scariest 30 seconds of my life. I began to have nightmares. I no longer went out onto the balcony, having drawn the heavy curtains and fastened them with pins I found in my closet drawer. I literally sneaked around the entryway in the morning and evening, and didn't feel safe until I took the subway a couple of stations away from mine. I no longer trusted for a penny the quite ordinary sounds behind the wall, the piano, the perforator, the morning cough of the neighbor on the landing, the sound of the elevators, the disgusting pops and the stomping of children's feet. Literally everything seemed fake to me. Someone was trying to trick me. I was missing something terribly important. Being a rather reserved person, I had not yet made friends in Moscow close enough to tell them about what was going on and ask for help. What could I tell at all? That my house was entirely populated by madmen, that a conspiracy of neighbors was working against me. The conclusion, obviously, would have been the opposite. There was only one crazy person here, and that was me. But I did not and do not feel crazy. Only a man who had stumbled by bad luck into some horror hiding under the mask of everyday life. On my allowance, I couldn't even move into a hostel. The dean's office explained to me that since I had written a waiver for the hostel, I could no longer qualify for it. All the places had been allocated. I was going to post a story about all this as it was happening, but I needed more data. And, of course, I didn't forget about my father for a minute. I didn't miss a single class and studied quite diligently, trying to spend less time in the apartment on top of that. So I only followed the residents of the house on weekends. They all turned out to be fake. They weren't living, they were simulating life. This became obvious to me soon enough. To check, I tried to observe the residents of neighboring houses, but I quickly got bored. People behaved normally and didn't notice anything. The same could not be said for the creatures that inhabited the hive disguised as a housing complex. The hive I was now living in. They would leave the house and go about their important business purposefully. They'd get on all kinds of public transportation and just drive in circles, looking out the window. Driving along the ring road, making pointless transfers and returning. They went into stores and left without buying anything. Going downtown, walking somewhere, then just turning around and taking the same route home. They were pretending to be talking animatedly on their cell phones, which I saw twice. As far as I could tell, none of them were working, and there were no outside visitors. The kids were running around the playground and making cakes in the sandpit, screaming with joy. They were making and breaking the same cakes over and over again, and they were running around on the same trajectory at regular intervals. No one was felling anyone. Not a child's game, imitation. The house is like a closed system, whose inhabitants carry out a mass of activities that make no sense at all, but leave the impression of ordinary life on the outside observer. Only I was no longer an outsider, and I was watching very carefully. I began to suspect that my life depended on it, that I just needed to understand what the fuck was going on here. There are little bugs in nature called lomeuza. Once inside a healthy anthill, they lay their eggs there. The beetle secretes a certain euphoretic substance, under the influence of which the ants lose the ability to act and think. They lose interest in the beetle and in everything in general, stop working and looking for food, and wander around idly. The eggs of lomeuza are indistinguishable from those of ants, and when larvae emerge from them, the drugged ants continue to feed the larvae as if they were their own. An infested anthill looks just like any other, but if you only look closely, you will realize how wrong things have gone. Lomeuza. That's what I was thinking, sitting on the bench, before entering the entryway and closing the door behind me. To a house where my laptop can't see any Wi-Fi network but mine. Where, it turns out, many apartments are rented at an attractive price, just below the market price. In my nightmares, I wander through empty porches and the strange maze of apartment corridors of the complex. Nothing happens, but this feeling. My anxiety gradually turns into panic, and I look for a way out, but I can't find it. I snapped, so I called my father. The verdict: either I stop being stupid, study and live here, or he takes my documents from the university and takes me home. He hung up on me. I just can't go back. But I can't stay here either. Every night the entire population of the house looks at me. Having been through a couple of tantrums, I seem to have exhausted myself emotionally. I go to class and carefully take notes that I can't make out later. The simple food has lost its flavor, though what flavor is there in the store-bought dumplings? Plans to find a job have been put on the back burner. Leadenhead in the morning. In the evenings I lie idly on my bed, listening to the sounds behind the walls, someone watching a movie, someone yelling at the baby. Everything is a lie. So a few more weeks go by like that. Tonight I was on my way back from the library late, past midnight, and as I walked past the neighbor's door, I just picked it up and pulled the knob. It's hard to say why. My state of apathy was to blame. The door opened into an apartment similar in layout to mine. Through the hallway I saw a lighted, hardly furnished room, and in the center on the bare floor sat my neighbors back to each other, an aunt, her husband, and a younger girl I had not yet met. Daughter. No one reacted to my appearance. The husband stared at the wall in front of him with a completely blank face. The mother and daughter were arguing animatedly about whether it was okay for the daughter to go out for a sleepover. Lively, such real voices. Turn around and you can picture with a smile a nice domestic scene. Their faces, both the aunts and the daughters, also expressed absolutely nothing. They weren't even looking at each other, they were looking straight ahead. The argument was interrupted by a half slap. Then all three of them looked at me. I did not have the energy for this. I simply went back to my apartment and collapsed on the bed. This was yesterday. When I woke up today, nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. A day just like any other, with the noises behind the walls, as if life goes on as it did the day before. I called my father again with the last of my money and told him about the situation. He calls me a goddamn junkie and says he knew it. He hung up the call. He's coming. It takes about 8 hours to drive to Moscow from our town. I'm not looking forward to living with my parents again for the foreseeable future. That is a better alternative than continuing to live in this insane asylum. I feel like something bad will happen to me if I were to stay. I think my father would want me evaluated for this whole ordeal. I just hope they don't send me off.